everyone. Welcome to La Gran Colombia. I'm Diego Gonzalez, the coordinator of student affairs for the coordinator of affairs for ISLA. I'm going to be the moderator for today, and I'm here accompanied with Professor Stephanie Gollop, who is the director of ISLA, and she's going to be introducing the guest speakers that we have for you guys today. Professor Gollop.
Thank you very much, Diego. I have a mouse which is kind of slow. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us today for La Gran Colombia. I'm Professor Stephanie Gollop. I'm the director of the Initiative for the Study of Latin America, which is based at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences here at Baruch. And our mission is to raise the profile of Latin America and the Caribbean, the region, the people from the region on the Baruch campus. We're very excited to be here today during our History and Politics Month to welcome three outstanding Baruch faculty and hoping that Baruch students really get a chance to connect with our fantastic faculty, and we all can learn together about how in order to understand where we're going, we have to understand where we've been in the Latin American and Caribbean region. This is this idea about where we were in the moment of independence is really important. So before we start, I will have a couple of people to thank. First, I'd like to thank Diego Gonzalez, who is the coordinator of student affairs this year at ISLA. This is his idea, and this has been a wonderful journey to bring this event to fruition. I also want to thank the Dean's Office at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences and Interim Dean Jessica Lang for the support and the encouragement to continue on with ISLA and build this program. And I want to thank our speakers, who I am going to introduce shortly. And I'd also like to thank Mrs. Hedwig Veit for her generous support for ISLA. And ISLA is dedicated to the memory of her grandfather, Valentin Lizana Iparragué from Chile. And so we are always thinking about the importance of Mrs. Veit when we have our events. So I'd like to start off right now by introducing our speakers for today. And just give a brief introduction. Professor Mark Rice, this is in order of appearance. Professor Mark Rice is an associate professor of history, specializing in Latin America here at Baruch College in Weissman. His research focuses on the history of the Andean region and modern Peru in particular. He researches and writes about the history of tourism, travel, and infrastructure in the Andes. Professor Rice is also studies and teaches the history of material culture, economic history, and social history. His first book, Making Machu Picchu, The Politics of Tourism in 20th Century Peru, was published by University of North Carolina Press in 2018. And his next book project, funded by a Fulbright Fellowship, will investigate the social and political consequences of road construction and infrastructure development in 20th century Peru. This semester, he's teaching History 1003, Global History since 1500, and he's teaching his elective 3071, History of Colonial Latin America. So thank you for joining us today, Professor Rice. Our next speaker after Professor Rice will be Professor Shombe Miles, who's an associate professor in the Black and Latinx Studies Department here at Baruch in Weissman. He teaches the history of race, class, and ethnicity in Latin America, specifically Brazil. His work is particularly interested in the Black diaspora in the Atlantic world. And his latest book, Race and Afro-Brazilian Agency in Brazil, was published by Routledge in 2019. This semester, he's teaching the Pathways course LTS 1003, Latin America Institutional and Cultural Survey, and the capstone LACS 4902, Cultures and Society, also cross-listed with BLS and LTS. And in this coming spring, he's going to be teaching an elective, which is BLS 3050, called Race and Global Inequality. Really excited to hear more about that. Well, he'll also be teaching the 4901 Latin American and Caribbean Studies capstone on Latin American and the Caribbean history and politics from the 19th to the 21st century. So welcome, Professor Miles, who also has joined us in previous events like the one we did on Carnival last February. And I'm happy to also introduce to our undergraduates, Professor Enrique Desmond Arias, who is the Marx Chair in Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs right here at Baruch in the Masters of International Affairs program. And he is Professor Arias his research focuses on security and politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. He's the author of Criminal Enterprises and Governance in Latin America and the Caribbean, published by Cambridge University Press, Drugs and Democracy in Rio de Janeiro, Trafficking, Social Networks, and Public Security, published by UNC Press, and is a co-editor of Violent Democracies in Latin America, published by Duke. And this semester, he's teaching his graduate seminar on illicit trade, and next semester, he'll be teaching Western Hemisphere Affairs. And Professor Arias joined us a few weeks ago for our open house on the Mark School. And if you missed that event, Diego will provide a link in the chat to our YouTube channel so you can get a chance to hear more about the Masters of International Affairs program. So I really want to thank all of you. This is a real, also, Marx and Weissman effort. This event, we're really happy to bring you all together. And so I'm going to turn it over to Diego to get the party started. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Golub. And we would like to also thank you guys again for joining us. And we will also like to say, again, thank you as you guys are joining ISLA on uncovering the historical events that brought these countries together to fight for their independence. And before we begin, also I just wanted to mention to feel free to raise your hand, as also add in the chat as we go along with the story of La Gran Colombia. And so we could also be interacting with one another. Now I'm gonna be passing it to Professor Rice, who's gonna be starting the story on how La Gran Colombia came to be. Professor Rice.
Thank you. And thank you, Diego, for organizing this event. It's really great. So the origins of Gran Colombia arguably go back to Spanish colonial policy, particularly at the start of the 1700s. A new dynasty takes control of Spain, the Bourbon dynasty. And these were the royal family from absolutist France, who kind of comes into Spain at a moment where the Spanish Empire is kind of in the doldrums in terms of its trade and political influence, and comes in with a mandate to basically reform and reinvigorate the Spanish imperialist project. And as part of those reforms, they involve a kind of breaking up what had been the viceroyalty of Peru, which was all of South America. It was just one, with the exception of Brazil, was one big viceroyalty in Lima, based in Lima. And the Bourbons do a few things. One thing is they break up this viceroyalty into different viceroyalties. One is centered on Buenos Aires, which is the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. And the other, which is New Granada, is composed of what is present day Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. So the idea behind this was to kind of break up this unwieldy and inefficient large viceroyalty to make it more manageable. And in doing so, they also internally opened up a lot of reforms to incentivize trade within the empire, and increasingly opening up trade to other imperial areas of the Americas. The interesting part about this is, so this has kind of differing results, right? It turns out that because this new viceroyalty is kind of created from the top down, these reforms are received very differently in different parts of this viceroyalty. In the eastern part, where you see Caracas and present-day Venezuela, these reforms are largely welcomed. These were people, and this was an area that was benefiting from increased trade, with food going to the Caribbean and importing, goods from Britain and France as part of these reforms. But as you kind of went more towards the south, especially into Quito and Ecuador, these reforms weren't as welcomed. This was an area that still had a lot of political and economic connections to Lima. And also its colonial economy was more based on older forms of manufacturing and trade. And for these areas, the actual reforms were kind of threatening, right? The importation of cheaply made British products and goods were actually threatening to the old manufacturers in and around Quito and the southern Andes. So as a result, already as this area was going into independence, the entire Gran Colombia population was kind of unified eventually in their opposition to Spain, but they were opposed to Spain for different reasons, right? If you lived in kind of Caracas, You thought you didn't like Spanish rule because it hadn't gone far enough, right? You were making lots of money trading, but you really wanted to trade even more with foreign powers and the newly independent United States. But if you say lived in Southern Colombia or Ecuador, you thought these reforms went too far. You didn't like them. You actually wanted to reverse them, right? So while the entire viceroyalty kind of is united in its dislike of Spain, and this proves effective during the independence wars, it means that once independence is settled, these lingering questions are still being remaining. So Simón Bolívar, right, the noted libertador and really quite good military commander, sweeps across these areas in 1819, and after a series of victories against the Spanish in what's present-day Colombia, declares the independence of Gran Colombia, right? But this is, and for largely reasons of convenience in some ways, he keeps the borders of this old viceroyalty. It's worth noting that at the moment where Gran Colombia is declared independent, Ecuador is still under Spanish rule, which gives you a sense of kind of some of the problems that might come into this. So as the Spanish are kicked out, these same questions kind of linger over what will the trade policy be? Are we going to embrace free trade or be more conservative and protectionist? And as a result, this large country begins to divide regionally. Certain regions want this free trade, others don't. And also, the country divides over what type of government it's going to have. Whereas Simón Bolívar kind of envisioned Gran Colombia as a single kind of unit, many others, particularly in places like what is present-day Venezuela, saw it more of like a confederation in which each unit would have a lot of discretion over its policy. So throughout the 1820s, you see these rather large struggles between what type of policy the country is going to have, and ultimately also how it will be governed to resolve these debates. And unfortunately, by the end of the 1820s, these policies this becomes unwieldy and the federation largely breaks up. Partly due to this, Simón Bolívar kind of almost dies practically of exhaustion from holding this coalition together. And when he dies in 1830, more or less the Confederation of Gran Colombia kind of dies with him, right? The one exception, I'm sorry if there's any Panamanians out there, is obviously Panama stays with present-day Colombia. It separates much later in 1903, but that's a very different story which involves U.S. empire, which we can talk about. But I would say that, in some ways explains the breakup of Gran Colombia. And in some ways, I don't want to sound pessimistic that it might have been inevitable, right? That it was very unwieldy to keep this large coalition together, considering their very serious domestic and international policy differences. But if that sounds a bit pessimistic, I would actually say the historical mystery isn't so much, I would say, why Gran Colombia breaks up, but actually I would give these countries a lot of success for remaining intact as they do. I think the real historical mystery or the success is why we don't have a Republic of Quito and a Republic of Antioquia, right? I would say the success of these countries is actually managing to get through most of the 19th and 20th century intact as they are. This was a really big coalition to keep together. And I think we get a sense of, because it inherited kind of this colonial border, was always going to be very difficult to keep together. So that's my historical preface, and I think I'll leave it there so we can hear from the other presenters, and I'm more than happy to hear any more questions people may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rice. And now that we learned a little bit more about what brought these countries together and the reasons for that, now we're going to be hearing about African Americans, especially how they got impacted with the movement of these countries coming together as La Gran Colombia, and how it was their day-to-day lives as well during this time. So now I'm going to pass it to Professor Miles, and he's going to go into a little bit more detail about that. Professor Miles.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, thank you, Diego, for putting this event together. So one thing I would like to say is that we should think about this from an international perspective. Ideas are circulating at this time. We're in the age of the so-called Enlightenment period. Also, another factor I think internationally is important is the question of the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution is the second state in the Western Hemisphere to claim independence in 1804, and is the first state to end slavery and declare racism or anti-Blackness illegal. And this is significant because the great liberator, Simón Bolivar, is actually going to go to Jamaica, but then to Haiti. And it sets a standard and vision of a possible new world, right? When he goes to Haiti, he meets the leader there, his name, André Pétion, who was the president of Haiti at that time. Actually, Haiti was divided. It was the North and South, and Pétion was the leader of the South. And and Bolivar struck a deal with him, and he said, I'm going to help you in this revolution for you to fight for independence if you end slavery, right? So one of the people that are going to help Bolivar in the independence movement in Latin America is André Pétion, who himself was a revolutionary, a fighter for Haitian independence. And so Bolivar accepts that slavery is ended. Bolivar accepts that and he agrees to end slavery if he's indeed successful. And Bolivar frees many of his slaves. And in this aspect, there's that international dimension to this. His relationship with ending slavery and ending racism is a bit complicated because what actually will happen with Simón Bolivar is, though he agrees to end slavery, he puts a condition on that. He says, I will end slavery, and this is Simón Bolivar, if you participate in fighting for independence, right? And as we'll see, slavery does not end in La Gran Colombia until really, for the most part, the 1850s. But anyway, I was asked to just talk briefly as well about what was life like for these people. Slaves and people of African descent were crucial into the whole development of Latin America, and most certainly in La Gran Colombia. They were involved in almost every aspect of the economy, beyond just working in haciendas or plantations. They were in urban areas. They worked in construction. They worked in paving the roads and the infrastructure. They worked as domestics. They often were small entrepreneurs in the cities that sold foodstuffs. So they were involved in virtually every aspect of the society, working in mines, etc. Slave life obviously was something very brutal, inhumane, including violence against people, right? Separations of family. So slavery overall was a very brutal experience. And so from the very beginning, before there's even an independence movement, Latin American people of African ancestry were resisting slavery, and they formed runaway communities. And these communities existed throughout Latin America, in the Caribbean. Even here in the United States, believe it or not, there were maroon communities. These runaway communities where slaves lived and developed their own communal existence. Sometimes it would be very temporary, sometimes it would be more long-term. And in many cases, not so many cases, but in some cases, they even negotiated with the Spanish governments to set up their own towns. So there were quite a few Black towns and regions in which people of African ancestries were able to basically live autonomously. And this continued through the struggle for independence and after the struggle for independence. Esmeralda, off the coast of Ecuador, is an example of this, but also in today, what is Colombia, in Venezuela, Panama, all of these places, all of them had maroon communities. So slavery would supposedly theoretically end in 1821 with the Free Wound Act, but it doesn't really, okay? Because the onus was on the slave. So if a mother could provide a substantial fee, they could liberate them and their children in 1821. But if not, they would have to wait until the age of 18. Once they reach 18, then they could possibly be free. Even then, there was a possibility, and in many cases, they weren't free. So the 1821 was not really the end of slavery. And slavery doesn't end in what is Colombia in 1851, Ecuador, 1852. Panama slavery did more or less end in 1821. Peru, which was the northern part, was part of La Gran Colombia, 1854, and Venezuela ended slavery in 1854. So during this period that we're talking about, slavery was still in effect, right? It was on the decline, but it was still existing, and there was still enormous resistance. And I should say, slavery was on the decline. Many people of African ancestry had gained their freedom. But life after slavery was still very arduous and very difficult. One of the main problems was a kind of ideological organization of the nation and the ideas of modernization, which often had large cultural projects. And those projects gave deference to Western Europe and to North America. And also it was an era of the emergence of what we would call eugenics, right? And the ideas of superior and inferior races. You know, and these ideas of eugenics expand even into Europe. Many Europeans believe that, for example, Southern Europeans were inferior to Northern Europeans. Jews and Gypsies had special racial traits. So it was the age of racialization. In Latin America, there was this idea of whitening, the idea of the whitening idea was that through European immigration would be a way of modernizing and pushing the country forward. You know, I'm sure many people from the region have heard of Mejorando la Raza, improving the race through these ideas of eugenics or these racial ideologies that put people of African ancestry as inferior people. And, you know, these kinds of ideas, the actual results put people of African ancestry at a disadvantage in the labor market, socially, right? Who they can marry. Often families see people of African ancestry as less. So there are all kinds of repercussions for these kinds of ideologies that existed. You think about representation. Who do you want to be your diplomat? Who to perform on television, in cinema? There was an idea of European or whiteness as being something better, right? And so these ideas were very powerful in the 19th century and the 20th century, and they still hold currency to today, unfortunately. people of African ancestry and indigenous ancestry tend to be at a disproportionately lower in the socioeconomic markets. And then also there tends to be enormous invisibility of people of African ancestry, right? The idea that there really aren't these people there, the history is not really discussed or talked about. But in recent years, and I would say in the last 30 or so years, you've seen a lot of advocacy groups. You've seen within, for example, in Colombia, Venezuela, these advocating on behalf of people of African ancestry for more inclusion in society and to rethink a simulation as opposed to a multicultural society where all people's ancestry and legacy is valued. And I think these struggles are, and I'll just conclude on this note, these struggles are part of a global conversation, because there are many similarities, whether it's in the Hispanicized side of Latin America, or whether it's Brazil or in the Caribbean or right in the United States. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Miles, for sharing a little bit more on people and after, slavery as well, and how it was for them looking for jobs and all of that. Now, before we continue and seeing how those countries have been after their split, I just want to open it up to any comments from the audience, if you guys have any, or any reactions to what we have been learning a little bit more right now. You could raise your hand, as also add it in the chat as well. No comments? It's okay. So now we could look into a little bit more on, Professor Golub.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted. Yeah, I'm going to just say something very brief because I see that Sarah also has her hand up. No, I was fascinated also, both of you bringing up this international perspective. Professor Rice talking about trade, right, and about the fact that how does a new country survive? It has to have trading partners and the like. And Professor Miles raising the possibility of what a different world it would have been if with Bolivar allying with and going to Jamaica, going to ID, right, and thinking about what a different world it would be. Haiti ended up being a victim of a terrible embargo, right? It was completely isolated, and I think that's another piece of this story, which is interesting. Is like, how did it end up being that Gran Colombia, that Bolivar's project also required him to trade? And who was he trading with? He wanted to trade with the United States, and U.S. had an embargo against Haiti. So that there was that sort of moment, as you've been laying it out, about the sort of the idealism about independence in those both perspectives, but then the reality that these were both in both cases, both La Gran Colombia and the United States as new powers, and having to deal with trade with the old continent. So I want to thank you both for raising that issue, that we understand the region, we have to understand its international connection. So thanks very much, and I'll pass it over to Sarah.
I don't have a lot of knowledge about the history of Latin America, and I was wondering if you can give us a sense of scale, comparing the proportion of the population in the various countries that formed La Gran Colombia, how the proportion of how many slaves to non-enslaved people, and is that a higher proportion or less than in, say, the American South? Is that something I have a little bit more frame of reference for?
Okay, that's a good question. It's interesting because it depends on the region, right? So it's the same thing as the U.S. So in the U.S., the Carolinas have the disproportionate amount of slavery early on, and then it goes to Mississippi, where you have more slaves, right? What today is Colombia, I think would have the larger African, disproportionately of people of African ancestry. Obviously, Panama will have a large amount later of Caribbeans going to Panama. But Venezuela too had a large amount. The exact ratio, honestly, I don't, that's a good question, I don't know. But I know Ecuador is a little bit less. Though it's still there, it's, the African population of Ecuador, according to many activists, is about 10%. According to the census, is like 7%. So a little bit less. But if you go into certain regions of Ecuador, like Esmeralda, off those islands off Ecuador, you have a larger portion as well. And another thing about that, though, too, is these former Maroon communities are places where you see a large presence of Africans there as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add to that. I mean, yeah, Shambe, I agree with exactly what I should say, Professor Miles, I should say. You can tell we're colleagues. But not only was the experience of slavery in this area was incredibly diverse. You know, if you were in, like, you know, coastal Venezuela, you would have seen a plantation slavery focused on the export of cash crops, similar to what we think of in the US South. But as you went into the more heartlands of the Andes, slavery was widespread, but it was often more urbanized. And so, especially in Spanish countries, many enslaved people actually worked in blacksmith shops as kind of household servants. And so slavery was actually a much more urbanized factor. I mean, I don't know exactly Quito, but I do know that for most of its colonial existence, Lima was a majority Black city. The majority population of Lima was of African descent, a mix of enslaved, but also free people of color. To give you, so I mean, the experience of slavery is also really diverse in this area.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for asking that question too. Now let's move on to like looking at these countries now after they're split, after they have become in their own independent countries. And from that, we're gonna be hearing from Professor Arias, and he's gonna be giving us a little bit more insight on this. Professor Arias.
Well, thank you, Diego, for organizing this, and Stephanie also. It's kind of a big task to talk about all these countries since 1830, and certainly beyond the scope of my expertise. I guess one thing that I want to agree on, and that I see as central to this, but I agree on with both Professor Miles and Professor Rice, is understanding the histories of exclusion in these countries as a root of their politics. I don't think we can really understand history pretty much anywhere, but in this region in particular, where I'm familiar with it, you have to understand contemporary politics and contemporary issues and tensions, at least in part as a result of the history in which different types of populations, different portions of the populations have been excluded and exploited over the course of the history. That certainly has been the case, as Professors Miles and Rice said, with the Afro descended populations in these countries. But it's important not to forget also the indigenous peoples in these countries and the mestizo populations, which have suffered a great deal as a result of Spanish colonialism and the practices associated with it in terms of losing their land and eventually land and wealth being concentrated in a relatively small elite in most of these countries. And the country that I can probably tell the clearest story of from this perspective is Colombia, where I've lived and done research, where there has been, over the past 70 years, ongoing civil conflict, in particular since the 1960s, an insurgent war between the government and various insurgent groups, including the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the National Liberation Army, the People's Liberation Army, and others. And the root of this conflict really is land distribution in the country, right? I mean, this is what the Revolutionary Armed Forces organized around. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia remain fundamentally a peasant army, to the extent that they continue to be mobilized. There's a peace process going on in Colombia. And they have been organized since their earliest beginnings around the issue of land being concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of Colombians, and large portions of Colombians living, in relative penury, as they work on land largely owned by other people. And there's a lot of complexity to Colombia because Colombia is a highly geographically diverse place. So different regions of Colombia have different economic products, and that has been connected to different types of land holding in different countries. But generally speaking, there is a long history of these types of exclusion that has resulted in a huge amount of tensions in the country, right? And early on, well, not early on, but in 20th century, right, there is a substantial debate over reforms in the country, over land reforms in rural areas in the country, and that is what leads to the outbreak of civil conflict in the middle 20th century that continues to this day. And that experience has resulted in, at different moments, not only the conflict between the government and the guerrillas, but also government efforts to move poor rural laborers around the country, right? So there were efforts at land reform, but the efforts at land reform were in many cases half-hearted. And rural laborers, from the Andes were moved out into the Amazon or to other regions of the country, pushing back kind of the frontiers of Colombian society, very much against peoples that were living on the periphery of those societies, whether it's Afro-Colombians living on the Caribbean coast, who've seen the expansion of plantation, of industrial plantation agriculture, like bananas and palm oil in the north, or indigenous peoples living in the south in the Amazon. And there's been a long history of tensions around this. The government subsidized the expansion of settlement in different regions of the country to help, the Andean peasants whose land was being redistributed to in different parts of the country. But eventually, under international debt pressures and things like that, they reduced that dramatically in the 1970s. And then these peasants living in different regions of the country, in some cases, turned to growing coca leaf, which is a traditional crop in the region, going from Colombia all the way down to Peru and Bolivia, that was consumed by indigenous peoples in the region, both for energy and for ritual purposes. But as we moved into the 20th century, it began to be mass produced for medical effects, distilled into cocaine hydrochloride, what we know as cocaine, the drug today. And with the 1960s and 1970s, this emerged as a really valuable illicit international export. And so you had the expansion among Colombians struggling to survive in very complicated conditions, the production of coca leaf and then the commercialization of it by criminal organizations. This all contributed to funding illicit organizations, including guerrillas in the country, and the empowerment of guerrillas and the entrenchment of warfare in Colombia over the last 30, 40, 50 years. So Colombia has faced this ongoing conflict, and we spend a lot of time, talking about, narco traffickers and criminal cartels and narco guerrillas in the country. But to really understand the roots of that conflict, right, that has been a huge burden on that country over the years, you really have to understand the dynamics of economic exclusion and the way people in those countries, people in Colombia, have struggled to survive under very difficult circumstances in a government that systematically is looking out for the interests of a relatively narrow upper class that controls most of the valuable land in the country, to the exclusion of the large, working majority, especially in rural areas. There were a series of different and more successful areas to incorporate the urban working class and middle class into the political system and to provide them with certain social benefits. And that's a story of Colombia. Venezuela, is a very different story. Venezuela, had the benefit of having petroleum, large amounts of petroleum, which is always a double-edged sword in some ways. So there was a project in the middle 20th century in Venezuela to build a more robust state with growing, economic support through investment from the petroleum industry in the country, which was quite successful in creating a real substantial economic boom and an expansion of the middle class in Venezuela in the middle 20th century. There were, of course, guerrilla movements in the country. They were less successful than in Colombia. But what ended up happening in Venezuela is there ended up being a great deal of corruption in the state, which is something that often happens in major petroleum exporting countries. And you got a populist revolt against this in the late 20th century, which eventually led to the election of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, which did a lot of positive things in terms of populist policies to address the ways in which many poor and working class Venezuelans have been excluded from that system. But that government itself has had a lot of problems and has encountered very serious economic troubles, and there are serious issues with human rights abuse in that country today. And that has led to, pretty substantial, that's led to a serious economic crisis in that country and a serious expansion of violence there. Those twin experiences have resulted in mass migration outwards from Venezuela into Colombia, which has done a fairly good job of receiving and treating Venezuelans relatively well, at least on a formal bureaucratic level. But it's important to see at least some of the issues facing Venezuela as connected to the ways in which the drug trade emanating from Colombia, which is the world's largest cocaine producer, how those affect Venezuela, which is a major cocaine trafficking conduit, and there is substantial involvement on the part of the government in that dynamic. The other two countries are in a slightly better, are in a better place in many ways. Ecuador also has large petroleum resources. They have a fairly progressive government. There are some issues with how committed the government has been in recent years to democracy. Petroleum resources, however, have played a role in expanding different types of government services in the country in recent years, and that's been positive. Ecuador does not have the types of problems with drug trafficking that Venezuela and Colombia do, but it doesn't escape those issues either because of its proximity to all of these other issues. It does not tend to be as violent as these other countries. And Panama, Panama has a special place in my heart. My father's Panamanian. I spent a lot of time there over the years. Panama has its own set of issues. It doesn't have petroleum resources. It does have the Panama Canal, which is a source of hard currency and income, has a relatively stable economy. It is a small country. I believe it has around 3 million inhabitants today, so it's tiny compared to these other countries. Panama faces a lot of problems due to its proximity to Colombia, in terms of the drug trade often moving through Colombia, through Panama, and up to the United States. Panama also has faced a crisis in recent weeks, in recent months, with migration from Colombia. Northern Colombia has become a major human smuggling hub, and there have been substantial challenges that Panama has faced as Colombia, where there's a lot of illicit activities and criminal organizations that facilitate this, being a place through which people transit under very dangerous circumstances, both because of the presence of criminals, but also because the border between Colombia and Panama doesn't have a lot of structure to deal with the type of humanitarian crisis that was emerging with migration between the two countries, especially a couple months ago.
Thank you, Professor Arias, and thank you all three Professor Arias, Professor Miles, Professor Rice, on adding to this story and for us to be able to learn a little bit more about this region. I was gonna ask you a question to you guys, but I feel like you already answered it, so I'm gonna just open it to everybody. So the question is, how was this union once in the region significant in understanding the country's social, political, and economical issues that we see today? I know it's a big question. I'm gonna type it in the chat for you guys to know a little bit, so you could read it. And if anyone wants to tackle the question, please raise your hand. Let's also add it in the chat as well.
I mean, to break the ice, if you want. I mean, for someone who historians usually hate historical determinism, and I think I kind of argued that in my presentation that from the get-go, Gran Colombia had some serious economic and political structural problems that would keep it together. But I would say, to a certain extent, the Simón Bolívar's dream of kind of these areas being united is still quite durable, because if you were to really take a snapshot of these two countries, Venezuela and Ecuador are as similar. Ecuador has as many similarities to Venezuela as it does to Argentina, but yet these countries, this idea of unity kind of still persists across these countries in a way that other types of confederations that also existed and then expired don't. I don't see a lot of public talk. Not many people lament the demise of the Peru-Bolivia Confederation, right? Or the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. But yet, I mean, there is an Andean community, which is kind of, a trade and policy group that unites these countries. It's not really, historically, it's not very, very effective, but it does exist and they meet. So to a certain extent, I think I don't want to be like Pollyanna here. I think there have been a lot of structural problems, but I'm also a bit, there's also a lot of continuity that persists. I saw in the chat, I might have misspoken. I didn't mean to say, I don't think Venezuela is very similar to, I think there's some commonalities, but I don't think there's anything, someone might dispute this, but I would say that the commonalities that connect Venezuela and Ecuador are similar to across Latin America, I would say. But yet these countries do think, the public policy in these countries do kind of connect them in ways that other Latin American countries don't.
Thank you, Professor Rice. So also, I just wanted to ask, if for anybody who is probably from the region. Oh, we also have Professor Golub. Professor Golub, you can go.
Yeah, so just before you move on to that next question, which I'm very excited for you to ask, I just wanted to bring this up, what Professor Rice was saying about the Andean region or the Andean community, the group of three and the like, that in a lot of ways it's interesting to think these are countries that have these shared problems. They have these shared challenges. And so I guess, there's in some ways the romantic idea of, Bolivar and unity, but there are also some actual pragmatic reasons why these countries might do better by solving their problems together. And yet we know that Colombia and Venezuela, for many years, Colombia being governed by the center right and being very much against Hugo Chavez, Uribe and Chavez. So we see also that politics intervenes, right? That the fact that these countries are independent and that we live in a world of sovereign states where there are these sort of battles over jurisdiction. So, I think it would be interesting for, those of you out there, students that are interested in Latin America, to think about that. Like, what are the not just the shared benefits that they could have as uniting, but also in what ways can Latin America, particularly the Gran Colombia countries, what are the ways they could work together to solve these problems that there's a real concern about, for example, like the humanitarian crisis of people moving across borders, and mentioning what's going on between Colombia and Panama. We're talking about Haitians, right? We're talking about Haitians that are going through, like the way that the countries are, the way that Mexico is also the country from which Central Americans are trying to get to the United States. In what ways can these problems be something that brings these countries together, even though we could see them not as necessarily positive things? So, Professor Miles, shall we go ahead?
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to add was, beyond even the question of territorial unity, there's also the question about class structure, right? So Professor Arias brought this up, exclusion, and that is a commonality in reality with all of those countries, right? The question of land tenure, of historically of land tenure, the exclusion the ideas of racial hierarchy that still prevail. As was noted, not just with the African populations, but with the mestizo and indigenous populations as well. All these groups tend to be disproportionately at the bottom of the society. And that's just across the board, whether it's Colombia or Ecuador or Peru, it's the same in all of these countries. So there's these questions about class, and that's entangled with these racial hierarchies. So, I mean, that's another way of thinking about it, is not something in one country. That's a legacy that comes from the history of colonialism as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you everyone. And I just wanted to ask for anyone who is from this region, maybe from Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, or even Brazil, even Peru as well. Like, how did you learn this history before? Like, how was it taught to you? Like, or yeah, like, you know, like how do you learn it, and how it has been different now, like that you were able to hear from 3 different professors, as also from the insights from other people as well. And if anything, I could go. Personally, I'm from Ecuador, so I remember I learned a little bit about it, like when I used to live in Ecuador. But then, like, coming here and then to the United States, it kind of opens a little bit more of like learning a little bit from a different perspective, rather from it being from Ecuador itself, but like from a bigger, broader perspective as well. So it was really also interesting for this event as well to hear from different perspectives as well, and adding it to like the actual facts and things that happen. Now I also want to open it up to the professors. If you guys, Daniela, you could go, Daniela.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Daniela, and I'm from Colombia. So yes, I did high school in Colombia, so it was pretty simple, the story that I was taught, and especially regarding the slave. I think there was a taboo, still a taboo topic in Colombia, and the discrimination of Black people is still very deep in our roots. And as I don't remember the professor that was talking about slavery, but Chocó is the area that has the most concentration of Black people in Colombia, and it's a very poor region. So see how the story keeps repeating in some ways, and yes, so it's very interesting to hear that again.
Thank you, Daniela. And we also had Catherine in the chat that she mentioned that she's also from Ecuador, and that she learned some of the facts here and there that we discussed today as well. Thank you, everyone. Also, I wanted to ask the professors right now, if you guys have any courses or any programs that students should know about, you could share that with us right now as well. So I don't know, any of you guys have anything to share?
Well, I'll start. Next semester, I'll be teaching a course. It's the first time I actually will be teaching it. Race and global inequality. Yes, so I'll be teaching that in the spring, 3050, I believe it is, course number.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, I mean, it's kind of fun. I mean, actually, I'm going to talk about Gran Colombia next week because I'm currently teaching colonial Latin America. It's the end of the semester, so independence happens, right? But I usually, my plan is to, in the fall, like a year from now, I try to rotate in modern Latin America, which we'll kind of talk about a lot of these topics. But I really want to thank you for organizing this, because at Baruch, I've always kind of, I said my specialization is the Andes. And I've always kind of wondered, man, maybe I'll teach a course on like Andean history. And I always kind of wondered, but I don't know if there's enough student demand for that. But seeing this, I guess that's a good sign. So maybe I need to started drawing up a syllabus with a focus on the Andes as opposed to modern Latin America. So that's actually, so stay tuned. I think actually the events like this are really quite inspiring. So thanks. So.
Thank you. And Professor Arias?
So I teach, my classes are in the Mark School at the master's level. I'm teaching next semester Western Hemisphere Affairs, which starts out, with the kind of a broad scope of history, but then focuses relatively rapidly on policy issues in the Western Hemisphere, including crime and violence, trade, but also looking at things like politics generally, and transportation, healthcare, things like that. I also teach a master's level class on comparative social policy, which is not Latin America focused. I focus on a lot of that class is on Europe, but also on Africa, Latin America, and Asia.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. And also thank you again to our speakers for bringing a little bit more of history and knowledge into our day-to-day lives as well. Also, please don't forget to follow us on our Instagram at ISLA Baruch. And also you can find us on Twitter. And if you guys will also like to be added to our newsletter, you can send me an email. I will be typing it in the chat as well. Again, thank you everyone, and I hope you guys enjoyed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.